Cinder de la Doom summons the Shadow Fiends. Chapter 8. Cinder de la Doom pulled the knob by her left knee, and the truck's headlights cut through the shadowy creatures clustered around the grill like twin lasers. For a fraction of a second, the young girl thought she heard screams, a chorus of hoarse voices squealing in torment as their bodies dissipated like ash on the wind. She certainly hadn't expected that, believing the headlights would simply increase the buffer between the truck and her stalkers. After all, flashes of lightning didn't seem to destroy the things, nor did the red and blue lights atop Deputy Hendrick's patrol car. So maybe it had to be a concentrated beam of light. Or maybe it had to be unexpected. Either way, Cinder felt as though she had a weapon now, making her comment about going to war all that more appropriate. The shadows which hadn't disintegrated in the initial burst of illumination had pushed further back, shuffling among themselves just outside the headlight's range. "So what is it then?" she asked aloud. "Concentration, surprise, or both?" Intent on finding out, Cinder pulled back on a rod jutting from the steering column, and the windshield wipers mysteriously began swishing back and forth. But at the same time, her desired goal had also been achieved. The high beams flooded even more of the street with light, and she leaned forward in the seat, anxious to see what effect this would have on her pursuers. There were no screams to be heard, nor did the shadows atomize into nothingness. Instead, they surged backward even more, retreating further from the truck. So the element of surprise did factor in. Cinder knew it would be hard, and perhaps impossible, to catch them off guard a second time. As much as she cherished the idea of wiping each and every one of these shadows off the face of the earth, there had to be another way. The problem, she decided, was she had no clue what that was. "But you know someone who does." The moment the thought floated through her mind, Cinder found she couldn't meet her own gaze in the rearview mirror anymore. She wrung her dress in her hands, squeezing water from the soaked fabric absent-mindedly while chewing on her bottom lip. "Wilhelmina Blackthorn. She told me how to conjure them. She could tell me how to send them back." But would she? Would she really? Part of Cinder was still positive the entire night had been carefully orchestrated by the executed witch. Wilhelmina had never mentioned anything about murderous shadows hell-bent on her destruction, after all. "Doesn't matter," she told herself. "My lunchbox is still in the crypt. And there's no way I could talk to Wilhelmina without the Ouija." That, of course, was a lie. One which Cinder recognized as soon as she uttered it. There were no magical properties instilled in spirit boards. These things were mass-produced on assembly lines in China and Taiwan. Hell, her own was a tin lunchbox, for God's sake. Did she really believe there were factory warlocks whose sole job was to anoint products with arcane properties as they rolled along a conveyor belt? Of course not. Cinder sighed and leaned across the bench seat, flipping open the glove box in the process. She rustled through crumpled receipts until she found a folded sheet of paper that seemed to be a shopping list. Smoothing the paper on the seat beside her, she rummaged further, eventually extracting an ink pen, a sample-sized bottle of cologne, and an empty cigarette box from the compartment. With the tip of her tongue poking above her top lip, Cinder de la Doom hunched over the paper and scrawled 2 rows which contained every letter in the alphabet. On a 3rd row, she wrote the numbers 0 through 9 and the words yes, no, hello, and goodbye, one in each corner. She then ripped a panel from the cigarette box, folded it into a triangle, and tore a semicircle into the folded edge. Once opened, this created a hole in the center of the triangle, transforming the cigarette pack into a planchette, or, as it was more commonly called, a Ouija pointer. Before beginning her ad hoc talking board, the girl had taken a moment to push in the truck's cigarette lighter, and she nearly jumped when the thing popped. A drop of cologne hissed as she squeezed it onto the glowing red rings. instantly vaporizing it. The entire cab was flooded with a scent that reminded Cinder of her grandfather's bathroom, and she wrinkled her nose to keep from sneezing. Normally she would have used incense, but cologne would work in a pinch. I call down the watchtowers of light and guardian spirits to purify this board and make it clean. Cinder closed her eyes as she whispered the incantation, trying not to think about the shadows outside the vehicle. Instead, she visualized a white ball of light streaming between her palms. It infused the paper with its power, driving away negative energies as she repeated the incantation again and again, waiting until a spirit chose to make itself known. Wilhelmina always announced herself with the scent of hay, and this time was no different. With her eyes closed, it was easy for Cinder to imagine she was sitting on a rafter in a barn, breathing in the sweet, earthy aroma wafting from the bells below. "Wilhelmina Blackthorn, is that you?" Cinder's fingers touched the makeshift planchette so gingerly it almost seemed as though the tips actually hovered just above the cardboard. Without any additional pressure, the triangle scooted across the paper. Lacking felt-tipped feet and an entirely smooth surface, the pointer jerked across the board until the word yes was centered in its hole. "I've got a bone to pick with you, sister. But there's no time for that now. I need you to tell me how to get rid of these damn things, these shadows. You tell me how to send them back, or I'll swear I'll ask every spirit I know to make your afterlife absolutely miserable. You hear me, witch? You tell me, and you tell me now." The pointer didn't so much as move. Perhaps she'd been too stern with the spirit and had pissed it off. Or, and this seemed far more likely, Wilhelmina wasn't sharing the secret because she didn't want to, because it was all part of her diabolical plan. "Thoth is my witness, your execution will seem like a super sweet 16 by the time my curse runs its course, bitch. Fucking talk." The planchette slid across the paper, pausing on the letter C, before skipping almost to the end of the first row and highlighting the L. Letter by letter, the dead witch once more spelled out instructions for her young pupil. The letters read, "Close the portal, dumbass." So that was it then. It was so simple that Cinder thought that she had perhaps known the answer all along. Simple? The girl shook her head at her reflection as if she couldn't believe her own thoughts. "Maybe you're forgetting the ravenous horde of demons lurking outside, or the fact that they want to devour you, or that Pleasant View Cemetery is all the way across town, or that there's no way this truck can make it all the way to the crypt. We'll have to get out and make a run for it at some point. Or are we using some new definition of the word simple that really hasn't caught on yet?" If she were perfectly honest with herself, however, Cinder knew that the objections were only a formality. She was simply going through the motions, her soliloquy a melodramatic rendition of lines that would have been at home in any horror movie. It wasn't that her current predicament actually needed any embellishment. It was already rife with danger, and the stakes, literally, couldn't be any higher. If she failed in this endeavor, she would die. But pretending that she was no more than a character in one of the midnight monster movies she loved so dearly somehow eased the fear gnawing at her stomach. Not by much, but it was enough to help the little girl do what needed to be done, no matter what the cost. "Okay then," she sighed. "If we're going to do this thing, we're going to do it right." Leaning into the floorboard, Cinder rooted under the seats, separating things which might be useful from empty fast food cups, crumpled bags, and withered French fries. The little girl then took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and whispered in a rhythmic sing-song. "With this sacred rite, on this darkest night, I call out to thee to lend me might. By hill, by cloud, by flame, by sea, I implore thee, protect me, protect me, protect me, so mote it be." With her protective spell complete, Cinder de la Dune sat as straight as she could and peered over top the steering wheel. Shifting the truck into drive, she released the brake, and the vehicle lurched forward as if it were a battle steed which could be barely contained. The engine revved and growled as the girl shifted back into park and adjusted the seat. Outside, the shadow fiends had been whipped into a frenzy. Those directly in front of the truck had surged away from the headlights when it seemed as if the vehicle was going to charge. But now they pushed forward again, staying just beyond the perimeter of light as they thrashed among one another. The brake and parking lights had a similar effect on the creatures clustered behind the truck, with only those on either side relatively unscathed. Even they had to keep a slight distance, though, for the little girl was being careful. Despite the unfamiliar controls, she had managed to ensure that the dome light in the cab never went off, keeping the closest of her foes at bay. With her adjustments complete, Cinder de la Doom shifted into drive again and eased the truck forward as she experimented with the steering. The wheel felt looser than she would have imagined, and the smallest correction seemed to have major implications on the trajectory of the pickup. As she crept along the block, however, the little girl grew more confident with the machine. She had always been a quick learner, so much so that her family and teachers sometimes described her as having intuitive knowledge, and driving proved to be no different. By the time she'd gone 2 blocks, Cinder had pushed the truck to 45 miles an hour. The windshield wipers slapped away torrents of rain as the truck fishtailed around curves, and the little girl struggled to maintain control, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The shadow fiends surrounded the truck, shifting and changing forms as some of the braver ones made abortive dives at the well-lit vehicle. They screeched and screamed, their shrill voices overpowering the downpour pattering against the roof of the cab, and Cinder's right hand snatched out, depressing the knob for the stereo in hopes of drowning them out. Part of her had hoped for a minor miracle, that perhaps the owner of the truck had left a clone of Zymox or old-school Baja CD in the player. Instead, the twang of finger-picked banjos ran scales around an upright bass rhythm, flooding the truck with instrumental bluegrass. In the short amount of time it took to turn the music on, the truck had careened into a mailbox alongside of the road, leaving an explosion of splintered wood and fluttering envelopes in its wake. Not trusting herself to steer one-handed while fiddling with the unfamiliar stereo controls, Cinder sighed and shook her head. If she pulled this off, if she actually lived through the night and managed to send the shadow fiends back to whatever Stygian abyss had spawned them, she'd tell this part of the story differently. After all, a decisive battle against the forces of evil should have a soundtrack as brooding and ominous as the events playing out, not something which would have been better suited for some slapstick redneck car chase through the bayou. Cinder jerked the steering wheel sharply to the right, and the pickup careened through the wrought iron archway that welcomed visitors to Pleasant View Cemetery. Sparks cascaded from the collision of metal and rock as the truck thudded against the stone supports, and for a moment it seemed as if the steering wheel were about to jerk free from the little girl's grip. She had instinctively eased off the gas and cut the wheel in the opposite direction, correcting the skid so skillfully that an experienced driver would have let out a low whistle of appreciation. The collision had shattered one of the headlights, though, and the shadow fiends rushed toward the passenger side, clamoring as close to the glow of the dome light as they dared. This was the closest they had been all night. Only a thin pane of glass separated Cinder from the dark spirits, and the girl's heart hammered in her chest. All the moisture drained from her mouth and seemed to leak from her palms instead, making the steering wheel feel warm and slick. If something happened to the other headlight, if something also happened to the dome light, she gulped hard and tried to push the thoughts from her mind. Focus on the plan, she told herself. You get this truck as close to that crypt as you can. We'll worry about everything else when the time comes. The one-lane road wound through the cemetery, and Cinder ignored the occasional signs advising of a 5-mile-per-hour speed limit. Almost there. The shadow fiends roared as though they sensed the young girl's intent. Their collective din overpowered the blaring bluegrass and shook the windows with its might, causing Cinder to accelerate in a subconscious attempt to flee from the sound. Just a little further. The truck's tires encountered standing water. Rather than splashing through the puddle, they slid over it like water skis, and Cinder's stomach lurched as her stolen vehicle hydroplaned out of control. She wrenched the steering wheel as her foot slammed on the brakes, but this only seemed to make matters worse. A series of thuds rocked through the truck's frame as it shattered headstones, and Cinder had just enough time to register a ditch before the entire world turned upside down. In some ways, it was over before she knew it. In others, it lasted an eternity. The truck rolling, banging, clanging, and thudding as metal crumpled and shocks jolted through her small body. Loose change and CD cases airborne for a fraction of a second, raining down on her, and then flying upward again as the world turned end over end. Regardless of how long it actually lasted, it eventually came to an end. The truck somehow managed to come to a rest in the upright position, but the hood was crumpled like a page of faulty homework, and most of the windshield had peeled away from its frame, the safety glass nothing more than a network of cracks and fissures. Clouds of sweet-smelling steam hissed from the engine block, and Cinder watched it for a moment as she tried to come to terms with what had just occurred. The seatbelt had undoubtedly saved her life, but it felt as though she'd been hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. Each breath radiated pain, and the girl mustered enough courage to look down at herself, fully expecting to see a gore-streaked rib jutting through the side of her dress. The fact that there was not even a trace of blood was some comfort. The pain was most likely caused by bruising then. Worst case scenario, a fracture or two. As the engine ticked and cooled, however, the initial shock began wearing off, and Cinder realized her injuries were actually the worst of her problems. The shadow fiends were still out there, bobbing and weaving among one another as they growled and hissed and rasped. The family mausoleum was still about 100 yards away, and the truck was obviously out of commission. The injuries would slow her down. Taking a deep breath, Cinder undid her seatbelt, leaned back, and kicked at the remnants of the windshield with both feet as she bit back stabs of pain. Fracture or no fracture, there was still a job to be done, and that job meant finally leaving the safety of the illuminated cab. And so it was that Cinder de la Doom wriggled out of the wreckage and onto the remains of the hood. As thunder boomed overhead, the shadow fiends worked themselves into a frenzy. They were close to their prey now, so close to the only person who could send them back, and they were not about to let that happen. Well, it seems like that the battle is coming to a head. Cinder still actually is kind of defenseless against these creatures. She knows what has to be done. She knows that she has some weapons. But how can she surprise them with the light? Especially when she's leaving the safety of her stolen pickup truck. These will be answered tomorrow night in what I believe to be the conclusion of Cinder de la Doom summons the Shadow Fiends. Good night.